I think the very simple answer is the future of banking is on chain. And we fully and wholeheartedly believe that. The more interesting question, I think, is how will retail individual access the blockchain? And is it going to be through non-custodial wallet apps like the MetaMasks and Phantoms and things like that come to mind? Or is it going to be through the JP Morgans of the world?
This episode is brought to you by BitGo, which is a top-tier crypto custodian that has been in the industry since 2013. It's headed up by Mike Belshue, who's a Web 1.0 and 2.0 legend. BitGo provides incredible services in addition to custody. They allow you to manage your tokens, get all types of liquidity, and much more. And some of the companies that use BitGo include Bitstamp Exchange, SWE, the token project, Pantera Capital, that's Dan Moorhead, as well as 21 Shares, which issues Bitcoin and Ethereum ETFs. Some of the great services that BitGo provides includes wallet services, which is secure, trusted, scalable wallet solutions. Prime services, which allows you to get seamless access to liquidity and capital. It also allows you to list, manage, and grow your ecosystem. And they have what's called the Go Network, which is a secure real-time global settlement. Recently, BitGo launched a retail platform that allows you to trade, stake, and of course, custody your crypto assets. And this is a great solution because it provides you with top-tier crypto security, and security is, of course, a big factor in investing in crypto. And BitGo is offering an incredible incentive as they launch this platform where you can get a chance to win Bitcoin. They're giving away at least one Bitcoin every quarter. So if you sign up and have funds on the platform through the last day of each quarter, starting December 31st, 2024, you can be eligible to win some free Bitcoin here. So if you'd like to learn more about BitGo, go to bitgo.com. Link will be in the description. Welcome into the Thinking Crypto podcast. I'm your host, Tony Edward, and my guest today is Kevin Lehtiniitty, who is the CEO of Borderless XYZ, which is a stablecoin payments network. Kevin, great to have you on.
Great to be on. Thanks for having me, Tony.
Kevin, you have an amazing background in crypto, a lot of stablecoin experience, so I have a lot of questions for you. And then I'm very curious as to what Borderless XYZ is doing as stablecoins have become a hot topic for cross-border payments and just payments in general. And legislation is on its way, so I think it's a good time for us to be talking. But let's kick it off with your background. Tell us about where you're from and what's your professional background.
Sure. I was originally born in France by the Swiss and German borders. So my family moved to the US when I was 6, which was an interesting experience for someone who doesn't speak a lick of English. So that was a little traumatic in one sense, but a very interesting challenge in the other. And we moved from France to Columbus, Indiana, of all exciting places in the US. Not New York, not LA, not anywhere particularly interesting. But my dad worked for Cummins, the Fortune 500 engine manufacturer, and they're based in Columbus, Indiana. So we moved there, and then grew up in Indiana. I grew up in the Midwest. Went to school at the University of Illinois for computer engineering, and when I was in college is when I first read the Bitcoin white paper. I started to get a little bit interested on the personal front in Bitcoin in 2014, something like that. It's been a while. Don't quote me on the exact time range. And from there started to buy a little bit, started to get involved in some of the Bitcoin communities, started to better understand kind of the potential of Bitcoin as a global money movement instrument. And I was always much less drawn to the replace the fiat currency side of Bitcoin, although I do think if Bitcoin becomes a global currency and it's a phenomenal asset for global reserves, like I'm very bullish on all those things. But I was always more interested in how Bitcoin could move value around the world in real time, 24/7. More so than I was about the fact that it was a new asset or that it had a speculative market price or things like that. So I don't think it's a surprise given those things that when I jumped into crypto full-time professionally, which was 2016 and onwards, I very quickly gravitated towards kind of stable coins, towards payments, towards those sorts of use cases. versus gravitating towards more of the Bitcoin maxi side of the house.
Yeah. So I'm curious your take on Bitcoin, how it's kind of morphed from being digital currency. And don't get me wrong, it could still be used. I can send you some Bitcoin right now and vice versa, right? And we can go shop at a merchant. But we know from a transaction speed standpoint and fees and so forth, it's not as efficient, right, for the average daily user. And folks are working in a Lightning Network, but stable coins seem to be the currency aspect that we can use. So what are your thoughts on how Bitcoin has morphed into like more of digital gold as a world reserve currency?
I think that's a great way to put it. I think the initial kind of Satoshi vision of this peer-to-peer electronic cash, I don't think has really been realized. And I think a lot of that is obstacles with retraining consumer behavior. A lot of that comes with various tax policies, right? Like even if you take the technical side apart and you think about Lightning and you think about some of these other layer twos that have been built on Bitcoin, like Core and others. I still don't want to have a taxable event every time I buy a coffee, right? And that's not something that Bitcoin can somehow solve. That's a tax policy issue. And until those sorts of things get resolved, and I don't necessarily think they will be, I think the better use case for Bitcoin is effectively as the soundest money we have, right? As a deflationary asset versus an inflationary asset. And as an asset, like you put it, as a digital gold, right? The biggest position that I have personally is in Bitcoin, right? I strongly believe that is the best way to preserve capital. It is the best way to grow capital. It is kind of the best possible thing that you could own outside of, including like real estate, gold, stocks and bonds, et cetera. I think Bitcoin is the king of that asset class. But I'm not gonna replace Venmo with Bitcoin. I'm gonna replace Venmo with stablecoins.
Yeah, well put. And your background in stablecoins is pretty big because you helped to launch TrueUSD back in 2018. Tell us about that. And was that your first go around with stablecoins?
That was, yeah. I led the product team at a company called Prime Trust from 2016 up until the end of 2020. And as part of that, we did a lot in the stablecoin space. And I was lucky enough to meet the team behind TrueUSD, which is now turned into like TrueFi and kind of all that stuff. And I want to say it was March of 2018. We launched TrueUSD as the as the first US based fully reserved stablecoin that had independent monthly balance attestations. The assets were held in a trust for the benefit of the token holders with a qualified custodian versus the assets being held in a corporate bank account somewhere offshore. It was audited. Those proof of reserves were published. I don't remember who the financial auditor was, but they were published on a monthly basis. And it was what has turned into USDC now before USDC existed. And then the team pushed into a basket of stablecoins. So we had the chance to help launch True GBP, True Euro, True CAD, True AUD. And I really think, although now they've obviously been surpassed by Circle and some of those folks, but at the time it was the first and fastest growing, not just USD backed stablecoin, but efforts to tokenize fiat currency on chain because it wasn't just USD.
And what blockchains were you using back there? Was it Ethereum?
It was Ethereum back then. And then there was kind of a concerted effort to go multi-chain. We also released the first stablecoin issuance as a service platform. So now obviously Paxos is very known for this with BUSD and PYUSD and USDG and all those things. And others are in the space like Bridge issues stablecoins, Braille issues stablecoins, a company called Bastion out of New York issues stablecoins, et cetera, et cetera. But at the time, this was the first. And that's where we started to go multi-chain. And we had maybe 20 or 30 stablecoins at the kind of peak of that platform. And this was in 2019 that were building stablecoins on Stellar, on EVM, across all these different chains. And our platform was kind of supporting that. And unfortunately, I think stablecoins are a winner take most market. And if you don't have a really strong differentiated value proposition, or you don't have a captive audience, right? So I think PYUSD is brilliant because PayPal controls so much distribution, right?
Right.
But if you're a Y Combinator startup that just says, look, we're going to tokenize currency, that's a tough road to go down. And
Yeah.
most of those stable coins just kind of fizzled out and never got the market caps that they needed.
Mm. Yeah, and I mean, when you look back and you look at where things are at now, how the stablecoin market has boomed. You mentioned Circle USDC, that has grown. Tether is still king of the hill, but is taking some
It
hits.
is.
But then you have, like you said, PayPal, Ripple. I think they just launched a stablecoin,
They did.
RLUSD. And then it seems like everybody, maybe some of these corporates or enterprises, want to do the same. Do you think it's
Oh,
going to
yeah.
become too saturated and there's going to be some consolidation maybe a couple of years from now?
I absolutely think so. I hear about a new stablecoin being issued on a daily basis at this point. And I think some of that is a function of VC capital and opportunity. So there's a lot of VCs that are looking to back new stablecoins that look at the profitability of a company like Tether and are very interested in issuing stablecoins for different purposes. I think what we're going to see is we're going to see three types of stablecoins that succeed. We're
Mm.
going to see the first category is going to be the USDC and USDTs, kind of the tier one stablecoins. I think USDC will own the more regulated markets, meaning the US and Euro with MiCA regulations and things like that. And Tether will continue to dominate the less regulated markets, Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia, where because of their regulatory position, which is very inverse to Circle's regulatory position, they're able to kind of make sweeping, user acquisition strategies in those regions. The second are going to be the ecosystem stablecoins, for lack of a better word. So think
Mm.
of this as like the PYUSDs and those where you have an existing company that has existing distribution and they don't want to give the interest revenue up to Circle or someone else. So they're going to create a stablecoin. They're just going to cram it down that distribution channel come hell or high water, pardon my French. And that's going to do okay for them. I think the same things will apply to kind of the closed loop ecosystems. So there's a company called Dakota, which is creating like an on-chain version of a Mercury. All those funds are held in a Dakota stablecoin. You cannot deposit or withdraw that stablecoin outside the platform. It's fundamentally an accounting and yield-bearing mechanism just within their ecosystem. I think stuff like that makes sense. And then lastly, the bucket I think that we're going to get is going to be more on the tokenized asset side. And it's maybe not technically a stablecoin, but it's going to be things like tokenized treasuries, T-bill funds, these interest-bearing stablecoins that are coming out, whether it's USDM, whether it's Movondo's tokens. I think one thing that a blockchain does that is interesting that hasn't happened before is not only can I send money 24/7 in real time on chain, I can also send an interest bearing asset in real time 24/7 on chain, like a T-bill token or something like that. And I don't quite have a great thesis on how that market evolves, but I do think there's going to be some winners within that bucket that are going to do very well.
Mm. Interesting. I appreciate you breaking that down because I never, it takes us behind the curtain a bit of the different aspects of how stablecoins can be used. A follow-up question on Tether, just because there's so much going on there with the EU MiCA regulation and how Tether was impacted. And I know I've seen Tether put out these quarterly attestations. But what do you think the challenge is there for them, and why can't they come into compliance? I mean, they're making so much revenue. They're largest. What do you think the challenge is there?
I think they would have to fundamentally shift their business strategy. And if they did, they certainly could. Tether is one of the world's most profitable companies by headcount, if not the most profitable company in the world by headcount.
Yeah.
And when you've achieved that status, why would you want to change your business model?
Mm.
Um, there is a lot of lobbying, to be quite frank, that they'd have to invest in. There is a lot of regulatory and compliance overhead that they would have to invest in. And it would fundamentally change the cost structure of the business and how they go to market. And I'm not Tether, so I can't speak from a first person perspective.
Sure.
But if I were Tether and I was sitting on the most profitable business that to ever exist on planet Earth, why change?
I'm a bit concerned for them though, because if you have the EU and then you have the US pass crypto stablecoin legislation this year, and to your point, they dominate, many markets, but the influence of the US and the EU could they influence certain countries and other nation states say, hey, we want you to follow our model and Tether's got to go? I'm a bit concerned for them there, but maybe they'll make the pivot eventually.
Here's my maybe spicy take. There is a really strong narrative right now around stablecoins being used for dollarization, right? So you have large amounts of retail users in places like Argentina, Kenya, kind of these emerging markets that have really weak local currencies. There's high inflation. There's a lot of problems with the central bank issued currency. And it's really, really difficult for them to open a US bank account and hold dollars natively, but it's really, really easy for them to hold a USD-backed stablecoin. And in these emerging markets, we see a lot of adoption coming from consumers on holding these stable coins as a proxy to a dollar versus holding the local currency. I don't have a crystal ball, but I can't imagine the central bank over time will take too kindly to that. A lot of the economic power that these governments have comes from controlling the currency.
Yeah.
And I don't see a world in which they allow their currency to be usurped by the dollar without putting up a fight. And if they start to do things like banning stablecoin usage or forcing conversion of stablecoins into local currencies or forcing conversions of their CBDCs or things of that nature, the companies like Circle are going to have no choice but to comply. The companies like Tether, I think, won't. They're going to be happy playing in the gray markets. And the gray markets are going to be what drive tremendous amount of volumes in these particular jurisdictions. And Circle is going to be pushed out of those jurisdictions, and Tether is going to remain king because they're not making these investments in being, the super regulatory friendly token and all those things. So I definitely think that there's going to be a vast gray market. And if Tether stays the course, I think they're going to be the king of those.
Very interesting. It's fascinating. I'm very curious how this plays out. And this, I wrote a newsletter. I think it was it early 2024 or sorry, late 2023, stablecoin wars, and talked a bit about these things happening.
Yep.
It's so interesting, but competition is good. It's healthy for the market. Let's talk about Borderless XYZ. Tell us about what you guys do and what's your mission.
When we started Borderless, we were really bullish on two things. We were really bullish on one, stablecoin adoption in a corporate institutional environment, much more so than a retail environment. We're bullish on the retail side as well. That's just much less our focus. And we were really bullish on the tokenization of real world assets. I helped write ERC 1400, which is the Ethereum token standard for tokenizing real world assets. So I've been bullish in this space for quite a while. I think that was like 2018, 2019, somewhere back then. And as we looked at the landscape and as we started talking to PSPs, payments companies, et cetera, that were mildly, I would say this was, a year ago. So there was a lot less interest in stablecoins than there is today after the Bridge and Stripe acquisitions and everything else. The thing that people complained the most about was the lack of a global network. And what I mean by that is that stablecoin liquidity is extremely fragmented along three different axes. The first axis we've talked a little bit about is tokens. USDC, USDT, USDM, USDG, USDL. I could go on and on and on listing more and more and more stablecoins. The second axis is various blockchains, right? You have the EVM world, you have the SVM world. There's a bunch of kind of purpose-built layer ones that are getting funded right now from a lot of the big crypto VCs to be stablecoin and payments focused chains that fragments liquidity even more. But the most interesting one was axis 3, which was the geographic fragmentation, meaning there were locally licensed entities that had sprung up all over the world and are continuing to spring up faster and faster and faster that provide a stablecoin to local fiat currency conversion service and local fiat rails. And these companies would be companies like Bridge in the US, BBNK in the EU, Bitso, which covers kind of 4 countries in LATAM, Yellow Card in Africa, Reap in APAC, et cetera, right? I can go on and on and on and on. And as a PSP that's getting into the stablecoin space, that's incredibly complicated to navigate. And to us, it seemed a lot like the banking landscape in the 70s, where you have all these different banks that have sprung up in all these different regions. And something that people forget about the banking landscape back then is banks originally weren't allowed to do business in different states.
Mm.
So banks were kind of regionally segregated by states. And then you had all the international banks and things like that. And there's a little known company that no one has ever heard about that looked at that and said, what if we built not another bank, but what if we built a network of all these different banks where somebody would be able to leverage the network to transact anywhere that they wanted to without needing to forge hundreds of partnerships in all these different jurisdictions? And that little company no one's ever heard about is now called Visa. And we think there's a very similar opportunity, which is why we started Borderless, to create a similar network, but on the stablecoin side, where our view and our mission in life is to be the network that enables any stablecoin on any blockchain to be converted into any fiat currency in any country on any local banking rail. And if we can pull that off, we believe that's the missing piece of stablecoin infrastructure that's going to actually allow for the mass migration of payments, and not just payments, but also banking, lending, etc., to really move on chain. You need this global liquidity layer to exist to make it fully interoperable with local fiat money. And now all of a sudden you can build on top of the blockchain-based infrastructure, and you can build in ways that are faster, cheaper, more accessible, better, et cetera, et cetera. And that was the kind of the thesis why we decided we had to build Borderless.
Well, that absolutely makes sense. I mean, because to your point, if we're really looking to get this global adoption and make the movement of money faster, different, you have the challenge, like you said, of different currencies, liquidity, and all these things. That absolutely makes sense. And I see on the website, you're covering more than 50 countries and 23
We do.
currencies.
Yep, we have currently we have about 10 what we call participating financial institutions, or PFIs for short, which are the locally licensed regulated entities that are members of our network. And through those 10, we currently cover about 53 countries and all of the local banking rails. So ACH, Wire, PIX, Pay, SEPA, M-Pesa, et cetera, across those countries. And we spend basically all day, every day, improving the network in a couple of ways. And the first is the breadth of the network. So making sure that we can cover more countries, more banking rails, more fiat currencies by bringing on board more PFIs. And the second is the depth of the network. So we want to have a network that's incredibly resilient. In order to do that, we believe one of the first things that we need to make sure is that there isn't a single point of failure anywhere. So we want to have multiple PFIs that cover regions. That way, if there's a debanking, if there's a change in regulation, if there's a technical issue, whatever that looks like, transactions can simply be routed to another PFI that covers that region. And now the network is much more robust than any of its individual members are. And then from a price standpoint, of course, we can start to allow the PFIs to bid for flow, and that compresses the FX margins, which is better for the consumers and for the corporates that use us. And it's just better all around.
Mm. And I noticed you guys recently integrated the Celo protocol or blockchain, and
We did.
tell us a bit about that, and then what other blockchains you support as well as other stablecoins.
So Celo's gotten a lot of popularity in Africa lately. Like, being in the US, I think the world's default we still think about as EVM and kind of the Ethereum world. And I honestly feel like that's changing. I feel like the world's default has been, for the past year or so, slowly changing over from EVM to SVM and people building on Solana. But that's a very US and EU centric viewpoint. In Latin America, Tron still dominates the vast majority of transactions. In Africa, Celo dominates the vast majority of transactions. And Borderless's job is to move money. Borderless's job is not to kingmake a particular blockchain or another. So back to our thesis of supporting any stablecoin on any blockchain in any country, Celo was really important for us in order to improve and expand our liquidity across Africa.
So, like, do you currently support all the major stablecoins? And if there's others that pop up in the market, I'm assuming you'll add them in, as long as everything looks copacetic.
Exactly. So the distinction that I draw is I don't believe that algorithmic stablecoins are stablecoins. And I've said this since 2018, 2019. And you can think that I'm biased. I really don't care. That's a line in the sand that I've drawn. And that doesn't mean that those tokens are bad tokens. I just don't think you can think of them as a tokenized fiat currency. You should think of them as a tokenized financial instrument. And they carry whatever risks the underlying financial instrument carries. But that's fundamentally different from taking currency and putting it on a blockchain in a fully reserved, one-to-one capacity. So we have a lot of stablecoins that come to us and are looking for global liquidity support, right? It's really difficult to launch a new stablecoin if your stablecoin can't be used anywhere with fiat currencies. So we have those conversations. Depending on how the collateral is held, that's kind of the deepest dive that we do. We can get comfortable there. And then we support EVM, we support SVM, we support Tron now, we support Celo. And we're having conversations with a lot of these newly funded layer ones who come to us and say, hey, we're building a layer one for stablecoin payments. We want to be able to, have liquidity for stablecoins into fiat currencies in 50 plus countries. Would you consider supporting our layer one? And those are more business development conversations. It kind of that's an investment decision on our part with our resources. So it matters to us what the use cases are, what the volumes look like, what the financial incentives look like, et cetera, et cetera. We cannot do everything all of the time as much as we wish that we could. So we try to just kind of invest our resources and our opportunity cost in what we think is the best way possible.
When you mentioned about the different blockchains being used in different parts of the world, you mentioned Tron in South America, in the US, one more Ethereum, Solana, and as well as the EU. In Africa, Celo. It's so fascinating because sometimes people get, how should I put it, tribal, right? They can't see the entire view of what's happening in this industry and the asset class. And then it goes back to it's going to be a multi-chain world, and we have to have interoperability.
It is. We 100% believe it's going to be a multi-chain world. We think chains are going to win regionally. And then we also think that chains are going to win on a use case basis. And I think banking is a great use case where you have a lot of people that are building private chains or semi-permission chains versus fully non-permission chains. And you have some sort of a permissioning around KYC and things like that. I haven't seen a winner emerge there, but I think that something like that makes a ton of sense, right? A lot of financial applications are going to run on a KYC permission chain versus just SVM, EVM, something like that. So for us, it's important, again, not to pick winners and to be able to support ecosystems that are thriving wherever they thrive.
Tell us a bit about the companies or businesses that are using your platform. I don't know if you can name drop, but if maybe you can tell us the type or the industries that or the the different nuances, I guess, with them.
I'm happy to give you the buckets, maybe. Violating our NDAs is probably not the world's best idea. But generally, we think about customers in three ways. The first are the network participants themselves. So a lot of these network participants are, as I mentioned, locally licensed in particular countries and are not licensed in other countries. But they have customers that are interested in doing end-to-end cross-border payments. So the network provides liquidity to network members as well. So a company that has a license in, call it Argentina, but doesn't have a license in the US, can provide liquidity in Argentina and can then take liquidity in the US and can service an end-to-end flow themselves. So that's kind of our first customer demographic is the network. And someone asked me the other day what I thought was the difference between a network and an aggregator. And the best explanation I've come up so far is that I think aggregators are unilateral, meaning the flow only works one way, versus networks are bilateral. And that's part of why we consider ourselves to be a network, is because we have that bilateral flow where there are makers, there are takers, and most companies, not all, but most of our PFIs are both. The second bucket is what we would consider to be platform customers. And these are customers like wallet providers, as an example, custodians, et cetera. And I think custodians is a great market because custody is one part of a payments equation and liquidity is the second. So we have a lot of customers and partners in the wallet demographic who have paired their custody or their non-regulated wallet infrastructure, and they've combined it with Borderless's liquidity to bring an all-in-one solution to the PSPs. So in that sense, Borderless is kind of like a B2B2B, right? Where the kind of ultimate customer or fintech is a customer of the wallet platform, and the wallet platform is a customer of Borderless to provide that liquidity and those payments in addition to the custody. And then much more recently, we've started doing a little bit of work around corporates themselves. And we have a few customers that are kind of directly customers of the Borderless infrastructure versus powering a platform or powering liquidity in other regions for network members.
Mm. And then you mentioned the wallet folks that you work with, the partners, Bastion, I think from the website, Fireblocks, Privy, and so forth. Are these institutional wallet providers or also for the retail?
Generally, both. So I would think of someone like a Bastion, a Fireblocks, and a Utila as an institutional wallet provider. They're going B2B primarily. Some of it is B2B2C, but it's primarily kind of the institutional flows. They're servicing PSPs, they're servicing PayFacs, payments companies, etc. And then I would think about the wallets that are more like Privy. I would think more as kind of consumer Web3 wallets, where they're much more likely to service a neobank that's servicing a retail end user. And that's a place where we've been improving the liquidity of our network because we really started off as institutional liquidity. And we've now been bringing on board support for more retail transactions that we can support people like Privy and others that are ultimately consumed by a retail individual versus by, a large corporate or PSP.
Hard question for you. With the adoption of stablecoin, legislation's coming in, more people are being onboarded into blockchain and crypto. We see that crypto adoption is growing faster than mobile phone and internet adoption, or faster pace, I should say. And you have this disruption that's happening. What does the future of banking look like and payments? Like, will we even need banks in 20 years, right? I'm not saying all banks are going to go away, but I'm sure there's going to be a thinning of the herd here because I don't need to go through JP Morgan anymore.
No, you don't. I think the very simple answer is the future of banking is on chain. And we fully and wholeheartedly believe that. The more interesting question, I think, is how will retail individual access the blockchain? Mm-hmm. And is it going to be through non-custodial wallet apps like the MetaMasks and Phantoms and things like that come to mind? Or is it going to be through the JP Morgans of the world? Mm. And the only difference is going to be your checking account is actually holding on-chain assets versus assets that are sitting in JP Morgan's database. These banks outside of the regulatory piece have phenomenal capital, phenomenal lobbying, phenomenal distribution and reach, where they're already ingrained in the lives of so many with credit cards, debit cards. They're still running a lot of the lending books, things of that nature. I don't know that the rise of on-chain banking is necessarily requires the banks to exit the market, if that makes sense. I think the average retail individual is highly unlikely to operate with a non-custodial wallet. Securing your own keys, doing some of those things is just a giant lift for a lot of people. If somebody uses my credit card and I don't recognize the transaction, there's a 1-800 number I can call. If I forget to log into my bank, there's a 1-800 number I can call, right? Et cetera, et cetera. Human behavior requires these safety nets. I think it's almost more likely that people will access on-chain banking through centralized institutions than it is likely that people will access on-chain banking through self-custody wallet apps.
That's a great
point. Now, it could be fintechs. So it could be like the Revoluts of the world, right? And the PayPals of the world and people like that. It doesn't have to be JP Morgan Chase, but I think it'll be centralized entities.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Because like you said, it goes back to human behavior, which we still like things we're familiar with, brands, things we're comfortable with, and make it easy. And then to your point, though, it might lean more towards the digital neobanks or things like that, where everything is more app-based versus I have to go to a physical location and things like that. But I'm sure these banks are like JP Morgan, Bank of America are going to scramble to try to keep up, right? And it's funny because years ago, JP Morgan, I'm sure you know, they launched JPM Coin, their own
Yep.
intrabank.
On it, and they launched Onyx and all of
Yeah.
that stuff. They've been on the cutting edge of some of this stuff.
Yeah, because that was like a stable coin, right? And they move it like internally, I believe.
Yeah, JPM coin, if I remember correctly, was a interbank settlement token that was issued on a private permission blockchain called Onyx. And the thought was almost to recreate a global version of like a clearinghouse or something like that, where banks could settle with each other 24/7 on this blockchain that was not publicly accessible. So you didn't have, rando retail user X. It was just the trusted banks. And then JPM coin, whether you call it a stable coin or not, I don't think matters a ton. But JPM coin was basically JP Morgan's promise of, settlements coming, right? Like if JP Morgan transfers you 100 million JPM coin, it's an IOU, but it's an IOU from JP Morgan. Like you feel like the settlement's going to happen. And I think using that to kind of net some of the interbank settlement stuff and mechanically move funds around makes a lot of sense. And I think we're going to see organizations like Nacha and other clearinghouses that get replaced by blockchain-based ledgers, which have a built-in consensus mechanism versus a centralized entity having to run the consensus.
So with the context of everything that we just spoke about, and that is, people moving towards these payment networks, they're familiar with the brands of some of these banks. Yesterday, the SEC repealed SOB 121, which allows banks to be able to partake in crypto and hold it on their balance sheet without it being a liability. What if Jamie Dimon says, okay, game on. I'm going to launch my own public stablecoin. I'm going to put it on Ethereum, Solana, and all the top chains. Everybody
Yep.
come partake. You know JP Morgan already.
I expect that they will.
Hmm.
And I put that in the same bucket as PYUSD of the
Hmm.
stable coins that are going to be created by people who already own massive amounts of distribution, have giant brand presence, et cetera, et cetera. And I would imagine that would get some uptick fairly quickly if you're JPM issuing a stable coin. And I think there's going to be a lot more enterprise players, whether it's the likes of the Visas or the likes of the FISs of the world that sell a lot of core technology into banks. They're going to start to create modules for stablecoin issuance and management. And all of a sudden, once stablecoin capabilities are inside of your bank core system, that's going to be the unlock that really brings banks into this market directly.
Man, Kevin, I'm really fascinated to see what happens this year and even into 2026 because I can't imagine these banks who have been held back, right? They couldn't touch it, they couldn't hold, they couldn't build, do much with it. They did their private thing like JP Morgan, but if they can go all in and there's nothing, no more hurdles, it's gonna get really competitive.
It will. I think there's a lot more optimism around, especially the early moves of the administration, in addition to kind of how they've signaled things. And I don't want to turn this into like political commentary, but I'll give one example. Um, Towards the middle of last year, we had a few enterprise customers that were really interested in working with Borderless and being able to access this liquidity network and provide liquidity to it and take liquidity from it in other regions and things of that nature. And ultimately, the deals died twice because the risk teams determined that they just can't work with a US based entity. And Borderless.xyz is a US based company. Um, if it's impacting us as a small startup making our way in the world and trying to do things right and trying to grow in this market, imagine how it's impacting the institutional players. And I think now with this new administration, David Sachs made it very clear last week at the crypto ball. He took the mic on stage and opened with the reign of terror on crypto is over, right? The age of innovation in crypto has begun. And I think that's given the green light, not just to people in the US to start to build and innovate, but also people outside the US that they can work with US based companies instead of having to say, look, sorry, we love the tech that you're building. We love the network that you have, but we just can't take the regulatory risk being a non US company of
Mhm.
working with a US company.
I'm sure that's like to your point, the crypto executive order, the end of regulation by enforcement, all these things that are the stars are aligning for our industry here. It must be a burden off your shoulders as a innovator and entrepreneur that you don't have to look over your shoulder, so to speak.
It is. I think we still have a responsibility to do things kind of the right way,
Mhm.
for lack of a better word. And I think crypto has gotten a really bad rap that the blockchain industry doesn't want to be regulated, and that's what they're crying about. I think that's very untrue. I don't think the blockchain industry has ever cried for no regulation. I think it has cried 10 out of 10 times for more regulation, clear regulation, guidelines that can be followed, guidelines that actually protect consumers versus kind of regulation by enforcement, which is a lottery and a crapshoot for everybody. So I think everybody is really excited that things are being repealed, and then also now there's the Senate subcommittee that's focused on digital asset regulation, and that we will finally get clear rules so that we can become a much more mature industry that is able to cross the chasm into much more mainstream adoption.
Yeah, I mean, I'm so excited for this year, and I'm sure as someone who's been here for a long time, longer than I have, um, going back to your roots with Bitcoin and then moving into stablecoins, must be pretty amazing. After look, especially after the past 4 years, it was pretty rough, but the doors are opening
Yep.
up here. The sun is shining down on us, and I think we're probably going to see a really big boom in this industry this year.
I think so. Having been full time in blockchain professionally since 2016, I've seen Operation Choke Point One and Operation Choke Point Two,
Mm.
um, and it's really reassuring that some of those documents are finally coming to light. And again, that we're going to get better, stronger, and more clear regulatory frameworks that set a really good sandbox, not just for crypto based companies, but also for consumers. you know, we don't, as an industry, we don't want another FTX. We don't want another Celsius, right? That impacts consumer perception of blockchain in a massive way that's extremely negative. Um, and sure, we can self-police a little bit, um, but it's not going to be as effective as a strong regulatory framework, which is what we're all hoping for.
Yeah, absolutely. I think both sides, right? We self-police, but also we need the government to put some guardrails in place because there's too many variables and any Joe Schmo can launch this coin and go rug people. We can't have that. Like that,
We can't.
that'll do so much damage. But boy, I'm optimistic this year is going to be so great. So actually, what's on your roadmap for this year?
It's for us, it's more country support, right? Like in one sense, it's really exciting that we already support 50 plus countries. On the other hand, I'm really disappointed that we only support 50 plus countries. There's a lot more than 50 countries in this world, and we want to create this universal layer that can be used to move money anywhere. And when we look at the number of countries that are supported by the SWIFT network or the number of countries that are supported by the Visa network, 50 is a blip compared to them. And we want to grow extremely aggressively in the breadth of our liquidity and the depth of the liquidity to make sure that there exists this infrastructure to move money with stablecoins. And that can enable the coming wave of, again, PSPs, payments companies, fintechs, etc., just the world moving on chain for banking and payments.
Kevin, if JP Morgan, Bank of America, or even PayPal came knocking, we want to acquire Borderless XYZ because we know this is the the way forward. Would you sell to them for the right number?
Look, there's always a price, right? This is America. I'm a
Yeah.
for-profit entrepreneur. There is
Mhm.
always a price in which things make sense, and I think we're going to see a lot more M&A activity picking up. We've already seen some. I think, especially over the next 4 years, there's going to be a lot of resources that are invested in blockchain innovation, and a lot of these bigger companies they buy versus build. And there's going to be a lot of major acquisitions from a lot of the big players that start to snatch up some of the startups that are doing well in the space.
Mm. Kevin, I got some wrap-up questions here for you. First, if you could create your own metaverse, what would the theme be?
Ooh,
Where would you put your
that is
Oculus
interesting.
go to?
Um, probably the business answer would have to do something with banking. That's a really boring answer. The personal answer, I'm a giant nerd about airplanes. That's that's a thing. It's a bug I've had when I was a kid. I wanted to be a pilot for years and years and years. When I step into a plane, the first thing I do is look left and just stare at the cockpit for a few seconds until I shuffle back to my seat. It would have something to do with being able to interact with aircraft.
Mm. Very nice. And rapid fire questions. Favorite food?
Ooh, um, I've been on a big health kick for the past year, trying to cut down on processed foods, trying to cut down on refined sugars and things of that nature. But my guilty pleasure that I just cannot shake is chocolate chip cookie dough ice cream.
Favorite musician or band?
Oh, these are great wrap up questions. Um, I listen predominantly to top 40s music. Right now, probably Halsey is on rotation more than anything else.
Favorite movie?
What have I seen recently? I recently watched Wicked, and I don't know that it's my favorite movie of all time, but it was certainly a really good movie, and it's the one that comes to mind as being recent.
Favorite book?
Ooh, I've been reading something simple. Something is not in the title. It's like amazingly simple or something like that, which is the book on Apple's marketing strategy that was written by a guy who worked at Chiat Day, and worked on the Apple account with Steve Jobs, in addition to Intel and a bunch of other places. And he kind of compares and contrasts the humanity that Apple brought to conversations versus, the thousand songs in your pockets marketing strategy
Hmm.
versus the Intel Xenon X 2.4 gigahertz, 32 megabytes of RAM, product spec focused marketing. And I've really been enjoying that book.
I'm my background is in marketing, so I'll definitely have to check that out. I love those concepts. When I watch Steve Jobs clips, at least, where he talks about marketing and his approach and things like that.
It's a solid one. I highly recommend it.
Definitely check it out. What do you do for fun when you're not working at on Borderless?
In the winter, skiing. That is my number one winter hobby. And then during the summer, it's paddleboarding.
Mm. Kevin, absolute pleasure. I love the mission of Borderless XYZ, and you guys, I think, are helping to boost adoption both on the business side and retail side as well. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, Tony. I appreciate it.